Good evening, everyone. Good evening. On behalf of Union Theological Seminary, it's my great delight to welcome you to this evening's conversation on the spirit of justice between the amazing Michelle Alexander and the amazing Angela Davis. And here with me is the amazing Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who is the new dean at the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary.
Thank you, Serene, and I join in saying good evening to all of you, and I am pleased to be here joined by the amazing Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, who is the president of Union Theological Seminary.
Oh, thank you. One last thank you. Thank you to the Reverend Michael Livingston, who is up here at front, who is the executive minister at the Riverside Church, and we're very grateful that they allowed us to move this evening's conversation from James Chapel at Union, which holds about 300, to this place, so we could have all of you here tonight. So tonight we're here to talk about justice at a time of grave political injustice. And it's a special opportunity that we have to listen in on a conversation between two very well-known freedom fighters for justice.
They're, in fact, freedom fighters for racial justice, for gender equity, for prison reform, and indeed, they have been witnesses and continue to be witnesses for a better way of being in the world. Now, before we begin this conversation, we have to handle a few housekeeping things. First, tonight's conversation is being live streamed, and the entire event will be posted to the Union YouTube channel on Monday. For those of you who use social media, please join this conversation on Twitter and Facebook using the hashtag Spirit of Justice. We also request, regarding your taking of photos and videos, we ask that they be taken when our guests first come to the stage. But once the conversation begins, we ask that no photos or videos be taken. It's distracting both to our guests and, of course, to those around you. And we also would like you to be very present in this moment.
After the conversation, we're going to have about 20-25 minutes for a question and answer period. If you wish to ask Ms. Davis a question, please raise your hand at that time, and someone will come and find you and give you a microphone. And we ask that you keep your questions short, 30 seconds or less. Remember that, 30 seconds or less.
We're going to ding you all.
So that we can have time to get as many questions and as many voices heard in that period of time.
Now, to introduce and say a word about my colleague, Michelle Alexander. Michelle is a visiting professor here at Union. She, as you all know, is an acclaimed civil rights lawyer, advocate, and author of the book, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Michelle has been a law professor at Stanford Law School and at the Moritz College of Law at The Ohio State University. She is currently co-teaching a class with Professor Andrea White at Union called Race, Law, and Political Theology. And then I must add this personal note. To be in the company of Michelle Alexander is to be made better by her presence, not simply because of the work that she does, but because of the person she is. To know Michelle Alexander is to know one who exudes integrity and embodies a passion for justice. In the words of Mahatma Gandhi, Michelle Alexander embodies the change she wants to see.
Amen. It's hard to know how to begin to introduce Angela Davis, activist, philosopher, feminist, prophet, voice of the oppressed, best-selling author, indomitable fighter for dismantling racism and white supremacy, a two-time vice presidential candidate on the Communist Party ticket, an outspoken socialist and communist critic of the U.S. capitalist system, a formerly incarcerated woman who is herself a fierce fighter to abolish our racist prison industrial complex, an outspoken lesbian woman of color standing up for full LGBTQ equity and inclusion, and the list goes on. If you haven't read her autobiography, go home tonight and start. And then read Women, Race, and Class. Then read Are Prisons Obsolete? And find her newest book. It's a great title, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. Her life story is the story of many in this country who have given their lives over to the struggle for justice. She was born in Birmingham, Alabama, and like probably many people in this room, became an activist against racial injustice while still a teenager. Just a few of the facts about her life. In graduate school, she was a member of the Black Panther Party and the Che Lumumba, which was an all-Black Communist Party group. She was fired because of this affiliation from UCLA, because of her association with communism. She fought her firing and was rehired. In the early 70s, she spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's most wanted list. Her case became an international movement. She is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to dismantling the prison industrial complex, and she is currently Distinguished Professor Emerita in the History of Consciousness program and Feminist Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She's shown us through her witness that all oppressions are interconnected and that dismantling them requires an all-encompassing movement for liberation. Never forget that Angela Davis has always been a movement person, calling us to take collective direct action to change the system. Let me add on a personal note that as a young, privileged, white Christian girl growing up in Oklahoma, I first heard about Angela Davis when I was 11 years old. It was 1971, and I heard about her from my summer church camp counselor, who was also a committed communist. After hearing his stories, I hung her picture, along with the pictures of Bernadette Devlin and Dolores Huertes, on the wall of my bedroom as women revolutionaries who I yearned to follow. If you don't know the other two, go look them up. Without her inspiration, I would not be where I am today. And last but not least, she is a woman of profound spiritual depth. Not just abstractly, but practically. Angela Davis embodies the spirit of justice. Or to use a biblical image, within her soul, the waters of justice run deep and righteousness pours out like an ever-flowing stream. Friends, I give you Michelle Alexander and Angela Davis.
Good evening. Oh, it's wonderful to see all your beautiful faces here. I am so excited about this tonight. All right, well, thank you so much to Serene and Kelly for that welcome. I am absolutely thrilled to be here with all of you, but especially thrilled to be here with Angela. In many respects, this is something of a dream come true for me. I've been hoping to have this conversation for some time, and I've been eager to introduce Angela to the union community. As many of you know, I made a big decision about a year ago to leave the world of law, litigation, and policy advocacy in order to come to a seminary, Union Theological Seminary. I felt compelled to begin wrestling with deeper questions about the nature of our social, political, and economic systems, questions that didn't feel welcome in most legal and policy spaces. And although I don't really consider myself a Christian, as I'm inspired by and feel connected to many faith traditions, over the years it's become increasingly clear to me that justice questions are fundamentally moral and spiritual in nature. Ultimately, I think we have to ask ourselves, how might we live in right relationship with one another, honoring the dignity and humanity of all? What type of economic and political systems are most consistent with human liberation? How do we co-create a nation and a global community where every voice and every life truly matters? What is necessary, individually and collectively, to overcome histories of oppression, repression, control, and marginalization? And what are the values and belief systems that ought to ground us and guide us? What are we willing to do or unwilling to do to make another world possible? These are the very questions that Angela Davis has devoted her life to wrestling with and attempting to answer. And I'm thrilled that I found here at Union a community of people, of students, people of faith, people of conscience, including many who do not claim a faith or a religion at all, who are eager to wrestle with these questions and dig for meaningful answers. Which brings me to our conversation tonight. Several months ago, I told Serene Jones that I'd love to host a public dialogue series that's devoted to wrestling with these very questions that brought me to Union in the first place. And she said, well, who do you want to talk to? And the very first person I named was Angela Davis. Angela, yes. In so many ways, you represent what this dialogue series is all about. You know, we've entitled this series The Spirit of Justice, and your spirit is as bright and as beautiful as it was when you first burst into the public consciousness. Your spirit has remained on fire, even as you've changed and evolved over the years, and the times have changed and evolved and devolved to some respect. Hearing from voices like yours, I think at this moment in our history is as vital as it's ever been. The last presidential election was a very painful reminder that it's dangerous to view American history as a slow but steady march towards greater freedom, justice, and equality for all. But one thing I think is clear, and that's since the days of our nation's founding, there have always been people of all colors, backgrounds, and walks of life who have in various ways shown up in American history as revolutionaries, challenging us to reimagine what dignity, justice, and equality ought to mean, and forcing us to reconsider who should be worthy of care, compassion, and concern. And I think Angela, in so many ways, exemplifies what it means to live life fully animated by a spirit of justice. Whether or not you agree with everything she has ever written or said or done in her life, it cannot be denied that her spirit is alive with a passion for justice. So let me begin by saying a very personal thank you for being here and for your courageous voice and your willingness to be in dialogue with our community. We are very, very happy to have you, are we not? Well, where to begin? I guess it's a bit of a cliche to say that the personal is political, but I really can't help but begin with a personal question. I wonder whether you would be willing to say a few words about your spiritual and religious background. We're in a church, a great big church after all, and you've been invited by a seminary, and I know that there are many seminary students in the audience. Where are you? Yeah. Who are eager to understand their own spiritual journey, their spiritual path in relationship to your life's work. I know you grew up going to church and Sunday school, and that you've had working relationships and friendships with people of all faiths and a range of faith communities. But I wonder how you would describe your spiritual background and whether you see a spiritual dimension to the questions of justice I just described.
Well, first of all, Michelle, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'd like to thank Union Theological Institute for sponsoring this event. This was my first opportunity to visit Union, although it has played a major role in my thinking over the years. So thank you very much. And thank all of you for coming out this evening. It's really always great to be in New York City. And I have to apologize in advance. I have a cold. I think I'm recovering from it, but my voice sounds very strange to me. So hopefully it'll sound okay to you. My mother was a Congregationalist. And for those of you who know the United Church of Christ, the Congregational Church eventually became a part of UCC. And my father was a lay reader in the Episcopal Church. So I can remember as a child being shuttled back and forth, going to the Episcopal Church on some St. Paul's on some Sundays and going to the Congregational Church on others. Eventually, I think that because my mother was much more involved in religion than my father, because he eventually kind of stopped going to church, I ended up a Congregationalist. But that's not really that significant by itself. What I remember is the sense of justice. Yes, justice. That was always a part of our experiences there. As a matter of fact, many people have asked me, when did you first become an activist? And I don't really know when I first became an activist. Sometimes I say maybe it was when I was 2 years old or whatever. But I do remember at the age of 11, the First Congregational Church in Birmingham, which was located on Dynamite Hill. Some of you may be familiar with the histories of the the bombings that took place in that neighborhood. At the age of 11, I joined an interracial discussion group that was taking place at the church. Within a very short period of time, the church was burned. And I mention this because many people are under the impression that the 16th Street church bombing, as tragic as it was, claiming the lives of friends of ours, that was not the first time a church had been bombed or burned. It happened all the time. It was a kind of a daily or weekly or monthly occurrence. And so even though for a very long time, when I went home, I had to go to church when my mother was still alive, and I maintained a connection with that church. I came to consider my own spirituality more broadly, and how would I characterize my relationship to spirituality now? That's a complicated question. I mean, I've been practicing yoga for a very long time and meditating for a very long time. And it's only recently that it has become apparent to me that we have to figure out how to collectivize these practices. And what I so appreciate about the leaders of Black Lives Matter, of the network, Patrice and Alicia, whom I know best, is that insistence on acknowledging the spiritual connection and always cultivating that spiritual unity. And I think that is a major challenge of this period, particularly given the fact that we here in the United States of America have been very much influenced by the notion that the U.S. is exceptional, and that somehow this is the best place in the world. And you know, I'm not even going to talk about the current president. You know, but even Obama liked to talk about American exceptionalism, and I think that that is a major challenge today, and that we have to figure out how to produce relationships that go beyond the boundaries of space, and relationships that exceed the temporalities that we're accustomed to working with. And so I would say that that means that we have to move toward a spiritual dimension in order to develop those connections and relationships.
Yes, I mean, certainly exceptionalism implies superiority, and if you're going to have a relationship with another human or another nation that's based on recognition of mutual equality, it's difficult to imagine how that can be possible when using the language of exceptionalism. You know, I think many people who know your name but do not know the full body of your work understand you to be a revolutionary, or understand that you were.
Or that I try to be.
Or that you try to be.
Still.
Well, that's actually what I'm interested in, is what that means to you. You know, we're living in a time right now where it's becoming increasingly common for people to say that revolutionary change is required, or that what is needed is some form of revolution. Obviously, in the last presidential election, Bernie Sanders was calling for a political revolution, but well before Bernie, there was, you know, the Occupy Wall Street movement. There has been Black Lives movement for Black lives, where obviously more radical and revolutionary demands have been made, indigenous organizing at Standing Rock, much of the immigrant rights organizing, and climate change activism has become much more radical in its critique of capitalism and of our political system, and people have been more open in recent years about describing themselves as radicals or revolutionaries. And I find myself now wondering what kind of revolution we really want. There was a time when I was a liberal reformer and imagined that we could tinker with the criminal justice machine and get it right if only we filed more lawsuits or lobbied the right elected officials, that there was a way somehow to fix this system. And I myself now no longer hold that view and understand that it's impossible to reimagine our justice system without also facing the challenge of global capitalism and the way it generates disposable people and disposable communities. But what does it mean to say we want a revolution today? And in our class today that I co-taught with Andrea White and Kelly Brown Douglas, we talked about Jesus as a revolutionary and different models and understandings of what it means to be a revolutionary today. I'd like to show a quick video clip of you responding to the question of what it means to be a revolutionary back in 1970. Yes. So this video was actually filmed when Angela was in jail awaiting trial. Well, let's just take it from there, and then I'd love for you to respond to how you described what it meant to be a revolutionary then and whether it's changed or remains the same for you today. Can we have the first video?
Reverend Williams is the host of a weekly religious program on this station entitled Vibrations for a New People. Because of their friendship, Miss Davis asked to appear on Vibrations, and in so doing granted the first American broadcast interview since her arrest in connection with the August 7th, 1970 shootout at the Marin County Courthouse. Her pre-trial procedures have taken the longest time of any California trial in history. Throughout those 13 months, there have developed charges that she's a political prisoner. Because of this, she's drawn international attention and has become one of the central figures in a very large and militant movement reflecting the concerns of oppressed minorities. We're presenting this program at this special time because people of all persuasions from all parts of the country and the world have come to regard Miss Davis in strong terms. Most have formed these opinions in favor or against her without ever being exposed to her writing, her teaching, or other personal statements. If this program results in nothing more than better informed but unchanged opinion, it will have been worth our attention. And one final note. While this conversation was filmed in the jail where she awaits her trial, the discussion in no way touches upon matters directly related to Miss Davis's trial. It was filmed under specific guidelines and viewed by the attorneys involved in the trial. This represents further programming in connection with the various aspects of Angela Davis's involvement in the controversial militant minority movement.
Well, Angela, we're going to rap a little while about a number of things, but I guess one of the most important things that we can start off talking about is the fact that you have been called a revolutionary, a militant. Much of the media has pictured you this way. It's talked about all over the world. What what do you see as the meaning of the term revolutionary?
Well, there's no single simple meaning of the term revolutionary. A revolutionary is a man or a woman who is a lot of things, but basically the revolutionary wants to change the nature of society in a way to promote a world where the needs and interests of the people are responded to. A revolutionary realizes, however, that in order to create a world where human beings can live and love and be healthy and create, you have to completely revolutionize the entire fabric of society. You have to overturn the economic structure where you have a few individuals who are in possession of the vast majority of the wealth in this country that's been produced by the majority of the people, and you have to destroy this political apparatus which, under the guise of revolutionary government, perpetrates the most incredible misery on the masses of people.
Sounds like a pretty good definition to me. So when you see that, does that still feel as true for you now as it did then? And how would you characterize the nature of the revolution that's required today?
Well, first of all, I don't know whether I've ever seen this. But did you recognize Reverend Cecil Williams? Okay. He came into, well, let me tell you a little bit about my relationship with Cecil. After I was fired from my position at UCLA in 1969 for being a member of the Communist Party, he invited me to speak at Glide Memorial. And he did this long introduction in which he maintained that Jesus was a communist. And of course, he talked about, the throwing the moneylenders out of the temple and so forth. So yeah, that was Cecil Williams, who is an amazing activist and has made countless contributions, particularly in the Bay Area where I live and where he continues to live and work. Yeah, I think I pretty much agree with what I said. And I mean, as a matter of fact, I think probably it is even more true today than it was then, when you consider that 8 billionaires own and control the same amount of wealth as 50% of the population. That is obscene. And I don't even know whether at that time we could have imagined the extent to which capitalism would invade lives and countries and societies and dreams. And so in a sense, I think it might be possible to argue that we need a revolution today even more than we did at that time.
So has your understanding of what kind of revolution is required changed since 1970? Is the way you would describe it today different than the way you would describe it back then?
Yeah, it would be different. It would not dispute the necessity of structural change. But at that particular time, I think that many of us assumed that if we could only overturn capitalism and at the same time deal with racism, that the revolution would have been won. And of course, it was very important to recognize the degree to which racism lies at the very foundation of capitalism. As Cedric Williams pointed out, capitalism is racial capitalism. Capitalism would not exist without colonization and the genocidal assaults on indigenous people, the settler colonialism that incidentally still continues in places like Israel. But I think there was a lot more that we were missing. And not that we could have understood the complexity of change in the way we understand it now. This is what's really exciting about trying to be a revolutionary activist. I always say I try to be revolutionary. You know, I would never presume to point to myself as a revolution. But I try. What I find exciting is the fact that so many things change over time. We learn so much more as a result of trying to theorize and imagine the possibility of change that would be economic and that would also involve racial justice and equality. We began to recognize that there are other issues. What about gender? And not only what about gender as we perceived it when the term was initially introduced into our vocabulary, but what about gender within the context of a non-binary a notion and structure? But I often, and you probably know this, I often use the example of the ways in which the activism of trans prisoners completely revolutionized the way we thought about the prison industrial complex and the work that the institution of the prison does. It not only accomplishes the whole process of incarceration, and it's not only about catching the detritus of society are produced by global capitalism, but it's also about the ideological work that it does, how it makes us think about our relations to each other. And certainly the institution of the prison is an ideological apparatus. It promotes the ideology of gender with which we work. So there are things that are only possible to learn in the course of activist struggle. And I always like to use St. Clair Drake's notion of what he called the epistemology of praxis. There are certain knowledges that one will never discover in a text, but certain knowledges that are only produced in the process of activism, in the process of practice, in the process of praxis, the epistemology of praxis. And so what's exciting is that we have learned so much more. Yeah, I agree with what I said back in 1970. But I have to say that it was also limited as well. And I'm really happy that I've been able to remain alive in order to witness how things have changed. And I say this because, some veteran activists feel like they're being left behind, and they get really frustrated. And they want the movement to remain where it was when they were considered the leaders. And I'm just so happy that there are generations and generations standing on our shoulders, and they have accomplished so much more than we could have ever imagined.
You know, speaking of what's possible to imagine and what's not, I was struck in reading your book, Are Prisons Obsolete? How you begin in the introduction reflecting on the fact that even though you were doing anti-prison work and challenging the prison system, when you were a member participating and supporting the Black Panther Party and beyond, that you did not ever dream or fathom the possibility that, you know, from your jail cell in 1970, that our prison population would quintuple in the next couple of decades. That it was just absolutely unfathomable. But in looking at your clips, your video clips, I realized you did have some sense that something was brewing, that something was coming. And so let's take a look at the next two clips.
Are there more clips?
Oh, yeah. There's a couple more.
You didn't warn me.
There's going to be a couple more. The next two clips. The first one basically states the thesis of the new Jim Crow, like 40 years ago. And then the second one talks about what is likely if we don't raise our voices and get serious about what the prison system represents for our society. So can we take a look at the next two clips?
I wonder, do you really see this as a means of committing engaging in a contrived effort on the part of those who make the decisions of eliminating Black people? Is this a form of suppression also? To make sure, in other words, that Black people are railroaded into prisons, into jail?
Well, in the whole history of the United States, the impact of racism has been to attempt to contain Black people, has been to attempt to stifle the desires towards liberation. One of the ways in which this is accomplished is by trying to convince Black people that they're completely powerless before this huge apparatus, and that the police can just come into the community and pick someone out, kill them, as they have done on many, many occasions in the past, charge them with something they didn't do, railroad them to prison, send them to the gas chamber. This is just one of the many ways that the system, and it's not a contrived effort in the sense that it's done consciously by a few men up at the top. It's built into the system. It's built into it's built into the nature of this society. And getting back to the question of what a revolutionary is, Black revolutionary realizes that we cannot begin to combat racism. We cannot begin to effectively destroy racism until we've destroyed the whole system. One of the things that struck me then, and of course I'm constantly aware of this, is that because of the movement that has galvanized around me, there is a lot of public attention on me and my case, and there are certain kinds of things that I can directly appeal to people for. But what about all of the sisters and brothers that we've been talking about during this interview? What about all of the other thousands and thousands who are in America's prisons today? People should begin to realize that they have a responsibility to see to it that America does not head in the direction of fascism, and it begins right at the level of the prisons. That's why the prison struggle is so important, because I see it as being a signal as to what the entire society will be about in the future. And that's why I think it's in the interest of all of the people, many of whom may not know anyone personally in prison, but most black people, of course, have had some contact with the prisons. People should really begin to express themselves aggressively and boldly and demand that something be done about the prisons in this society today.
So that was back in 1970, and when I really sit with that reality, that you and others were calling on us, Americans, to focus on the prison system because what was happening then was a signal of where our society was headed. And yet somehow we didn't see what was ultimately coming. Why do you think it was so hard for us to see what was coming down the pike? What was the nature of that blind spot? Or was it that forces that we underestimated? Forces
Well,
aligned against
I don't think it was a question of underestimating it. There was no awareness at all about the predicament of people in prison. And I should say that many of us who were activists began by joining campaigns to free political prisoners. We were involved in campaigns to free members of the Black Panther Party, the Soledad Brothers. And this insight regarding the role of the institution of the prison, particularly with respect to the production and reproduction of racism, actually came from prisoners themselves. George Jackson, for example, if you read his work, you will see that he was one of the pivotal figures in urging us to move from a simple sense that we had to challenge political repression and recognize the institution of the prison as an apparatus of political repression, but rather we had to think of it in a larger sense. And oftentimes the insights of prisoners get lost. There's now the interdisciplinary academic field, critical prison studies, and that would not have been possible without the work of prison intellectuals. So I was, I think, giving voice to an insight that was developing at the time, particularly given the fact that the Black Panther Party had been founded in 1966, and there was this new consciousness about the role of new consciousness about the role of the police in our communities. And so these were ideas that were collective in nature. But it's true, I forgot that back in 1970, we were saying some of the same things that we're still saying today. Of course, we have a much more nuanced, much more complex analysis of how it is that an institution that is putatively designed to provide security for the larger society is so central to the historical production and reproduction of racism. But it took a long time before a movement could actually emerge. People were willing to stand up for political prisoners, but not for the criminals. Because there was this distinction between those who were in prison because of their political activities and beliefs, and those who were in prison because they had committed a crime. So we had, during that period, to work through new definitions of what counts as a political prisoner. As a matter of fact, that may have been, this was 1970. We did a book when I was in jail that I co-edited with Bettina Apteka. It's called If They Come in the Morning. Jimmy Baldwin had written me this open letter in which he said, if they come for you in the morning, they will be coming for us that night. And that letter was circulated all over the world and was in part responsible for along with, of course, the activism of communists and others in virtually every country in the world was responsible for that movement. Yeah, it was difficult to persuade people. Ideology is a hell of a thing. And I can remember talking to people sometimes who had relatives in prison, but they were afraid to associate themselves with a campaign that seemed to support in some way people who had been declared criminals by the society. And so again, talking about revolutionary change, thanks to the activism of huge numbers of people, thanks to your work, now this issue is central to our sense of possible democratic futures in this country. You cannot talk about democracy in the U.S. without talking about what has happened within the prison system. The prison, what we came to call the prison industrial complex, because we wanted people to recognize that it's also very much connected to global capitalism. It's very much connected to the fact that, and this is what we didn't see in the 70s. We didn't predict the explosiveness of global capitalism. We thought we had seen capitalism. We thought we knew what capitalism was. But then during the 1980s, when corporations, and this is when the guy who calls himself president made all of his money, by the way. When corporations began to move towards other parts of the world where labor forces were cheaper, and thus this deindustrialization process in this country, which left people without work, without jobs, and at the same time, we begin to see the deterioration of social services. The public good no longer makes any sense. Education begins to be privatized. Healthcare begins to be privatized. And so the very same conditions, and this is a connection that I think we have to constantly point out, the very same conditions which led to massive immigration and led huge numbers of people from those countries that were being exploited by the corporations that moved to take advantage of low wages there. The very same conditions created a situation where people with no work, no possibility of work, no way to get an education, get produced as you were saying, a surplus population, and you have to figure out what to do with them. And at the same time, the prison industry is developing so that if you can profit by taking advantage of the economic racism, the last hired are always the first fired, huge numbers of people of color without work and turning to surplus, turning to underground economies, right? And so, that's where the drug issue and other issues come in. So it's, yeah.
One question I have, or one thought I have, is that, as capitalism has changed and evolved since 1970 in ways that were impossible to predict, and as racism continues to morph and adapt in new forms, in ways large and small, not just from slavery to Jim Crow to the ghetto to mass incarceration or mass criminalization, but in ways that are smaller. I wonder, is it necessary for us to think even more deeply? And I have to say, I think the movement for Black Lives is an example of that kind of deep thinking about how the nature of our activism must evolve and adapt as well to the times. I had a conversation with Eddie Conway a couple of years ago. I had an opportunity to spend some time with him. And Eddie Conway was a leader in the Black Panther Party who was arrested and convicted of a crime he most certainly did not commit. He had an alibi he was charged with murder, had an alibi. His manager at the post office attested to the fact that he was there. He couldn't possibly have been at the scene of the crime, and was convicted, almost certainly for political reasons. Was locked up and spent, 40 years?
40 years.
40 years in prison. And so he mentioned to me that when he was on his way home from prison, after having spent 40 years locked up on account of his political commitment and his work with the Black Panther Party, on his way home, and the freeway or the bridge that he's on is being shut down by Black Lives Matter activists. And he's just overcome with emotion that, my God, I went in 40 years ago over police violence, protesting police violence, and now the road is being shut down. I can't even get home because another generation of activists are fighting over the exact same thing. 40 years of my life have gone by. And so I wonder, in reflecting on kind of the past 40 years, how much progress you feel we've made. It sounds like in many respects you believe that our thinking and our understanding has evolved in really fundamental ways. But when we look at the nature of the systems that we're challenging, both whether it's the prison industrial complex or global capitalism itself, how much progress would you say has been made, and what's required of us now?
Well, I think that we have to be able to say that there's been very little progress. At the same time, there's been an enormous progress. And recently I've been trying to think in more capacious terms, I guess you might say that. I'll tell you about a visit to Australia not that long ago. I go to Australia a lot because I work with an organization in Australia, women, it's called Sisters Inside. And so over the last 15, 20 years, I've made many, many trips to all parts of Australia. And I've been so impressed by the ways in which Indigenous people in Australia imagine their lives in relation to lives that have unfolded before them, a connection that they feel with people who lived 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. And it struck me that we rarely think in those terms. We think about who we are right now, our families, our communities, our issues, our struggles, but we don't imagine ourselves as having been produced by generations and generations of people. And what is most important about Black people in this hemisphere is that we see a continuous history of the struggle for freedom. And to me, that's what Black identity is about. It's not about biological characteristics. It's not about anything else. It's about this way in which the yearning for freedom has been passed down from one generation to the next. And so therefore, we must have a connection. We definitely have a connection with slaves who fought for their freedom, sometimes knowing that they would never experience it themselves, but knowing also that as a result of their actions, somebody would. And so I like to think, and I've said this several times recently, that we are the manifestation of the imaginations of slaves who were struggling for their freedom. We manifest their imagination. And so when you think about it that way, we have come a long, long way. But it's also necessary to have a capacious way of imagining the future and the things that we want now, which we are probably not going to get for ourselves. But we can want them for those who come after us, and we can feel connected to them in that way. And so I think the best thing that one can do is contribute to that continuum, to guarantee that we do the work right here, right now, that is necessary to produce yet another generation of activists. You see, many people thought that when the Ferguson protests happened, that it was the spontaneous protest. And I'm not in any way trying to belittle the courage of those in Ferguson who refused to say no and refused to go home. And we came back every day helping to allow us to imagine a new era of struggle. But this era of struggle is predicated on the fact that many people were activists and did radical work when nobody else was listening. But some were. And, I like to say we always have to act as if revolution were possible. We have to act as if it were possible to change the world. And if we do that work, the world is going to change. Even if it doesn't change the way we need it to change right now, it will change. And then it will, I am as anti-capitalist today as I was when I was 15. When I first read the Communist Manifesto, it said, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." And although the capitalist system has not been, fundamentally dismantled, there are a lot of cracks. And
Well, it
if we,
sounds to me like you're talking about activism almost as a matter of faith, as engaging in struggle, not because you know that change will come soon, not because you know that the world you hope to create will be possible within your lifetime, acknowledging that there's a possibility that the change you hope for may not come at all, but being willing to engage in the struggle anyway, with the faith that
well,
there
do we,
is some meaning to be derived and some value from the struggle itself, and looking back to see that you owe a debt to those who've come before you. Does that resonate for you?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think it is a way of countering the neoliberal individualism that persuades us that we are single, solitary individuals in the world. We have lost so much as a result of the impact of capitalism, and not just in terms of material goods. We've lost a sense of our connectedness to one another. And I think that activism can give that back to us, can help us. It's always about imagining another way of being, another way of existing in the world. And there was a time when I might have thought that at some point we'll reach that goal. But I don't think we will ever. Even if we manage to overturn capitalism, there would still be a lot more work to do. We would still be aware, we would still be developing new awarenesses of new issues. Back in 1970, when nobody could have imagined how important the movement of disabled people would be, and how central that has to be to the process of creating a new society. You know, no one could have imagined how we would be talking about gender. No one could have imagined that environmental issues would be the ground zero of social justice, because of course it makes no sense to achieve rights and freedoms for human beings on a planet that is destined to die. So, you know, I think that if we continue the way we should, there will be constant periods of enlightenment. New issues will always emerge. I don't think that we, as human beings, would ever reach the point where we can say, you know, whether it's 10,000 years from now or 20,000 years from now, we can rest. We've done it all. And I think that's what's so exciting about trying to be a revolutionary.
Yeah, it's about how we show up in this world in the limited time we have. Yeah, well,
And a willingness to accept the new, to recognize that there are always going to be new issues, and you're going to be challenged yourself, and that your old ways of thinking have to be questioned. So it's a constant questioning. That's what, you know, critical thinking is supposed to be, I suppose. But most of us aren't really good critical thinkers.
well, I'm getting the sign that it's time for me to turn it over to the rest of you, and I can't monopolize all of your time. Well, what we're going to do is allow a couple of union students to ask the first first two questions. And so I'd like to give an opportunity for Joseph, wherever you are. Joseph, there you are, Joseph Leduc, to ask the first question. Do you have a microphone or does someone need to come to you?
I got it. I think it's working.
Okay.
I appreciate you very much for your presence and perspective. We just read your book, Are Prisons Obsolete? And in that book, you say that the work of abolition is not just about prisons as isolated institutions, but also all of the social relations that make the permanence of the prison possible. So I interpret this as expanding the definition of abolition to encompass not only prisons as physical places, but also prisons as a social paradigm for organizing society. I think that that's what you mean when you're talking about it as an ideological apparatus. So how does this expanded definition of abolition, how does that change the way that scholars and activists should think about the work of abolition?
Well, thank you for raising the issue of abolition. And of course, initially we talked about prison abolition. And using the paradigm of anti-slavery abolition, we began to recognize that we could not simply focus on getting rid of the institution of the prison, because if one looks at the so-called abolition of slavery, slavery was abolished, yes, but it was not really abolished. It wasn't abolished because the kinds of institutions that would have made it possible to incorporate a previously enslaved people into a new kind of democracy were never created. And I'm not saying that the democracy would be the same as it is today. We make a mistake when we assume that it's only about assimilation, only about inclusion, only about diversity. You know, who wants to be assimilated into a racist society, a society that tries to deal with racism a society that deals with racism by simply arguing that previously marginalized groups should be assimilated into the society. And the same is true for if one thinks about how deeply misogynist this world is. And unfortunately, we only begin to think of this when it's in the news. But who would want to be assimilated into a society that remains just as misogynist as it was before? This is I think, the real mistake we make when we assume that things like inclusion and assimilation can solve the problem. And so with prison abolition, the idea is not so much that you just open up the prison gates, which wouldn't be a bad idea. I mean, I don't think anything would be substantially different if all of the prisons were open. But it's about creating a society that no longer needs prisons. So the project of abolition doesn't only focus on issues of incarceration. It focuses on economic issues. It focuses on housing. It focuses on education. It's actually about a revolutionary approach to restructuring society. And then we can also argue that the same thing is true of the police. You know, we need to abolish the police rather than, you know, we keep trying to make the police better. We keep trying to make prisons better. But what if we ask ourselves, what kind of security do we really need? And move from there. So I think abolition is a large project. It's an anti-capitalist project. It's a feminist project. And as a matter of fact, a term that people have begun to use in the last couple of years is carceral feminism, because it allows you to make a distinction between the kind of feminism that is really only about assimilating into the existing processes, racist processes, and the kind of feminism that one might call abolition feminism. But it's a project, it's a revolutionary project, let me put it that way.
Well, I'm not supposed to be asking any more questions, but I have to have a follow-up here. What I love about prison abolition as a goal, as an aspiration, is because it challenges us to imagine what kind of world we ultimately want to create, and could we imagine that the prisons we have today would be any part of that vision of what we want to create? I think most of us would have to say no, you know. I joked with my class today that when Martin Luther King said, I've been to the mountaintop and, you know, seen the promised land, what are the odds that there were a lot of prisons in the, you know, land that he saw from the mountaintop?
He didn't even say what he saw,
right,
by the way.
He didn't say. But the chances that, you know, there are a lot of prisons, you know, in the vista seem slim to none. But for those who are dealing either in their personal lives with high levels of violence, living in communities with high levels of violence, or I have a close friend whose sister was murdered, and who is a big fan of your work and who's here tonight, and she said, I love Angela, but I'm gonna have a really hard time if she starts talking about prison abolition. How is it, in talking about that aspirational nature, that the people who are fearful, reasonably fearful, for the safety and security of their loved ones or for themselves, can feel as though their need for safety and security, their basic human right to be secure in their own person, to be able to move through a community or through their own home without fear of violence, is reflected in that vision and in the language. You know, I think it's difficult when there is no alternative we have to offer for people who find themselves in that space to be able to say, I support prison abolition, if they don't have a conception of how they might be safe in a world like that.
Well, I think that we have failed to create conversations about the meaning of justice. And therefore, it becomes really difficult to imagine justice that isn't retributive. And you know, I remember many years ago, a very, very close friend of mine was killed. And I went to the trial of the man who killed her. And I realized that I wanted him to die. But at the same time, I knew that I was opposed to the death penalty. And so in struggling with that conflict between my personal feelings and what I knew was right, I think I finally reached the conclusion that if I for 1 second said that I wanted to kill this man, then I would be giving up. I would be violating my whole idea of what it means to create a society in which we don't rely on these barbaric forms of punishment. And although, I wish at that time, this was not too long after, it was in the 80s, and I wasn't familiar with restorative justice and transformative justice. So I wish at that time it might have been possible to develop some process that might have led to some form of healing. Because putting people in prison or killing people doesn't usually help those who are left behind.
Well, it can help those who fear actually being, in the case of domestic violence and situations where people fear that if the person is released, they will do more harm to them or others. But prisons, as we know them, as what they actually are today, as sites of dehumanization and cruelty.
And most importantly, as sites of the reproduction of violence.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that this is an easy issue.
Yeah.
But to simply imprison someone who is a perpetrator of violence is going to, in the final analysis, lead to more violence. And I don't know whether we as a society have come to grips with that.
Yes.
And I don't know whether we're willing to approach the really hard question of how do we rid our worlds of violence.
And part of it is that we don't even admit that incarceration itself is a form of violence, that we are inflicting violence when we kidnap someone off a street and lock them in a cage, that would be a violent crime if done by one private person to another private person, but when it's the state, suddenly it no longer becomes violence anymore.
Right, exactly.
And so for us to say we oppose violence, we ought to be serious about, reducing or eliminating violence in all of its forms, including the way it manifests through incarceration.
And sometimes I think we have to develop a perspective that, and I know this is hard to say, that is not simply based on what I feel emotionally I need right now. How do we develop a perspective that allows us to recognize that state violence is actually not that dissimilar from individual violence, and particularly when you consider the ways in which women are treated in prison, the strip searches and cavity searches. That's the state as perpetrator of gender violence. State as perpetrator of sexual violence. But I do think we have to figure out some alternatives. That is why I pointed toward transformative justice or restorative justice. A close friend of mine, whose husband was a member of the Black Panther Party, and it was actually quite a well-known case, was killed in Los Angeles, and the perpetrator, who was a member of another political organization, has been in prison all of these years, since 1969. And she is just beginning a restorative justice process with him. It's about creating new relationships. I can't say anything about this particular individual, but I do know if we assume that every time someone harms me, that I will harm that person in return using the apparatus of the state, we can be guaranteed that we will have a future of infinite violence, a future of infinite violence. And the question we have to ask is, what can we do now that would begin to change society? I like Faye Honey Knopp. Have you read her work? Faye Honey Knopp. She was a Quaker, and she was the person in the 70s who helped to develop an approach to prison abolition. In any event, she was an abolitionist. It's interesting, the Quakers were the ones who invented the prison, right? And they were also the first ones to say, we need to get rid of it. What she decided was that no one would take abolition seriously unless we dealt with the issue of child sexual abuse. Because that is the question nobody wants to talk about, nobody wants to think about, and the prison creates a place for us to deposit our inability to engage about the possible a future without a possible future without child molestation. And so for the rest of her life, she worked with men who had been convicted of molestation, child molestation, because she was convinced that somehow they held the answer. And there are organizations today, Generation 5, creative narratives, and where people who have been abused are working together with abusers to figure out a way to get rid of this terrible violence.
Well, thank you, and sorry for hijacking the Q&A period there for a minute. Quantez Presley, another student. Where are you? There you go. All right, I'd love to hear from you.
So thank you, first of all. To my question, in your book, Are Prisons Obsolete?, you mentioned that despite white abolitionists' passionate opposition to slavery, quote, even white abolitionists found it difficult to imagine black people as equals, end quote. Moreover, Gary Dorian, in his book, The New Abolition, W.B. Du Bois and the Black Social Gospel, he writes about how the inclusion of white allies in the founding of the NAACP caused more uncompromising voices like Ida B. Wells to be marginalized. It could also be argued that Obama's loyalty to white allies prevented him from promoting black-specific policy initiatives. So considering these realities, I'm going to ask my question in 4 ways, and you can approach it how you choose to. Considering these realities, what are the potential dangers, pitfalls, and/or limitations of white allyship in black freedom movements? Are white allies necessary for black liberation, or do white allies weigh down the pursuit of black freedom?
Okay. I appreciate your posing the question. Where are you? Oh, okay. I really appreciate your posing that question because I think it is a very important one. I have an ambivalent relationship to the term allies because when it comes to challenging racism, I think white people should know that they have as much of a stake in purging the society of racism as people who are the immediate targets. And I think this actually is a really interesting time. And I have seen more white people in general express a kinship with struggles against racism, whether you're talking about the young woman who was killed in Charlottesville and the amazing statement that her mother made. See, I think rather than allyship, we should talk about the other genealogies of the other white genealogies or something like that. Because there is a long history of white people who have put themselves on the line, you know, from John Brown, of course, and many of them were considered to be crazy, because you have to be crazy if you're white, and you're going to stand together with black people. Anne Braden, for example, who was one of the most incredible anti-racist activists I ever met. She was a mentor of mine, a white woman in Louisville, Kentucky, whose husband, Carl, went to federal prison because they bought a house for a black family at a time when it was completely illegal. So, you know, I don't know whether I want to talk in kind of abstract black-white terms, because this is what racism has done. It has produced these identities that don't allow us to really understand. I mean, have you seen Stuart Hall's Race, the Floating Signifier? Okay, it's a great film of his lectures about race and racism. As a matter of fact, I think there's a new collection of lectures that he did about 20 years ago at Harvard that were just published. Stuart Hall is the best example of someone who both acknowledges the role that racism has played, and at the same time sees race as socially constructed. You know, so how do you recognize the damage that ideology has done? And Stuart Hall says race is actually more like a language than it is anything else. You know, race allows us to understand our relations to each other. In this country, the very first thing we do is notice somebody's race. And if it's a bit ambiguous, you don't feel comfortable until you really know. Isn't that right? And that's a hell of a thing. But this is what we've inherited from slavery. And the work that we should have done in the aftermath of slavery 150 years ago, we have to start doing now. But I think that the work people do, the work people are capable of doing should speak for them. And you know, I don't know about allies. I kind of think we're all in this together. But at the same time, I respect the reason why we tend to use that term, because oftentimes white people get involved and they want to take over. You know, they get involved and they bring the very same racism which they presume that they are challenging, you know, into the campaign against racism. So, yeah, I guess that's the way I would put it.
Thank you. All right, the next two questions, we have asked a couple of folks who have been directly impacted by the prison system to share their questions. First, Michelle Jones, here. Where are you, Michelle? There you are.
Well, let's give Michelle Jones.
Yes, Michelle Jones.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh my God. I'll remember that forever. So, my question. The carceral state is an entrenched, tentacled tool of the U.S. empire. How do we, the post-incarcerated, effectively counter the extension of the carceral state into every facet of our lives? I'm speaking about the social and legal collateral consequences of criminal convictions. What techniques and strategies do we need to employ to really move from unfreedom to freedom for ourselves right now in this moment and for all of the thousands and thousands of people who are going to come behind?
I'm really excited to meet you because I'm actually giving a talk at a symposium up in Boston at Wellesley tomorrow, and I talk about your case at the beginning of my paper. So, well, you know, this country has locked up so much brilliance. You know, and you're an example. At Harvard, they really missed the boat this time. They really missed the boat. But you know, I think that that you're right about the extension of carcerality into our daily lives. I've been doing work around Palestine for a long time, and and Palestine really teaches us the dangers of the kinds of reforms that allow that kind of carcerality to proliferate. And I think that we have to be really careful about the kinds of reforms that we embrace. I'm not totally opposed to reforms, but I don't want reforms that are going to create more and more carcerality. I don't want reforms that are going to create better prisons, you know, bigger and better prisons, and reforms such as, you know, technological GPS trackers that have been introduced by some as an answer to mass incarceration. So I think that that we have to develop a consciousness of the meaning of freedom. And this has to do with, it has to do with challenging racism, because as I was saying earlier, if Black people, people of African descent in this part of the world have brought anything at all, it's a sense of the need to continue to struggle for democracy. The struggle for democracy in this country has been about the rights of racially oppressed and marginalized people. And it's so funny that it is often, we're often referred to as special interests right? Or identity struggles. Is that what they say? Identity. If it's like black struggles, or if it's LGBTQ struggles, or it's all about identity issues. What they call identity issues are actually the core of the struggle for democracy in this country. Yeah. And I think that prison intellectuals have played an absolutely central role. So I know that I felt so uplifted during some of the Beyond the Bars conferences. Have any of you been to Beyond the Bars conferences? Okay. And you know, Kathy Boudin, who is a close friend of mine, we went to high school together. We've known each other since we were like 14 or 15. Kathy, who spent over 20 years in prison, and she has this way of asking people who've ever been inside to stand up and feel proud about it. Why don't we do that here? Former prisoners, people who are formerly incarcerated, why don't we stand up and see who we are? You know, thank you. You know, and I guess I would say that when those who have suffered most, those who have been those who have been the target of multiple forms of violence and oppression, when they stand up, everyone stands up. You know, if ever black lives were to matter, that would mean that all lives matter. And so I think we have to learn how to identify with the struggles of those who represent the most marginalized, the most targeted with respect to violence. You know, for example, black trans women who are the targets of more institutional violence and more individual violence than any other group of people. And so when we stand together with trans women of color, we are defending freedom. We are defending democracy for all people in the world. So that would be my dialectic of freedom and unfreedom in answer to your question, Michelle. And maybe we can say hello afterwards, okay?
Topeka Sam, are you here? Topeka, good to see you.
Good to see you. I'm incredibly moved and always inspired when I hear from both of you. And each time, it's a heightened level of consciousness that I get. And just thinking about a former prisoner or formerly incarcerated person, I consider myself incarcerated still. I did 3 years in federal prison, 6 months in a halfway house, and the last 11 months and 20 days under the confines and surveillance of the U.S. government through U.S. parole and probation. And I think when we talk about gender violence and we talk about the violence that's against people of color, specifically in looking at the 4.7 million people who are in the country right now under this surveillance, I think it's important for us to start to shift the dialogue, to look at the incarceration that's within our communities and that's happening right now and how we can change that. But when I also think about the women and the sisters and the work that we do and the work behind, and looking at you up there from 1970, and thinking about the 20,000 women or so that were in prison then and the 220,000 women that are in prison now, what are the strategies that you would guide us to use in order to decarcerate and eventually abolish prisons? specifically for women?
Specifically for
Women.
women. Well, you know, there's a radical criminologist by the name of Pat Carlin who, some years ago, had this idea, and she's British. She had this idea that first, women's prisons should be abolished. And in abolishing women's imprisonment, it would be possible then to approach the larger question. You know, it's often assumed that women don't really matter because even though there are 200,000 women in prison, it's relatively small compared to the, more than, 2.5 million people. And I remember when I was in jail myself, and I had been doing all of this prison work, but it had never occurred to us to talk about women in prison. So that was like a really enlightening experience. And I often say that, I wasn't in jail that long, but that it was a real gift that I was able to have that experience so that I could continue to do the work that I do. But I think that we need to broaden the campaign around women in prison. And when we say women, using the category women, we're talking about women, all women, including trans women as well. And that we need to recognize that sometimes when you address what appears to be a small issue, a relatively marginal issue, that as a matter of fact, it sheds new light on the entire issue of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex. So one of the things that we've learned by looking very specifically at women's experiences is about the connection between state violence and intimate violence, state violence and individual violence, which is, I think, one of the hallmarks of what you might call intersectional feminism, that there is a link between violence that is perpetrated by the state and violence that is perpetrated at the level of individuals. And that insight, which actually came from women prisoners, who pointed out that the experience of imprisonment brings back memories of having been abused by partners, having been the target of intimate abuse. And so this allows us to develop a whole theoretical approach about the connections and the continuum between state violence and individual violence. So I think that we need to bring these issues to light. We need men to work around women's imprisonment, not just women. Women do all the work. Women do all the work. And women have been the prison activists. You go to any prison on visiting day, whether it's a male prison or a women's prison, and who will you see in the visiting room? Who will you see? Almost all women. So it's about time that the brothers started taking up some of the slack. And
Thank
but
you
thank
so
you,
much,
thank
Angela.
you.
I'm getting signs waving over here saying that we need to wrap up. But I absolutely want to say on behalf of everyone here, what an incredible gift it has been to be able to spend this time with you, and just grateful for your voice and for the way in which you've modeled for all of us what it means to live with a spirit of justice, in your soul. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom with us tonight. Thank you.
And thank you.